Hello, Tom.
Hello, Joe. How you doing?
All good. How have you been this month?
Yeah, I've been very well. Coming off the back of the Indie Game Clinic Game Jam, full of inspiration.
The strangest game jam concept I could come up with.
I've enjoyed explaining it to people. Everyone thinks it's really cool.
We've just done a game jam where we were making interactive music videos for, in our case, local bands, right?
Yeah.
What did you make?
I made a racing game where you control your racer by playing Snake for a local band called Fine Line. I'm going to have that song stuck in my head for probably that's a year now.
Yeah, you definitely need a way to turn the music off very quickly and debug to not drive yourself mad when you're making an interactive music video. But thanks for coming back. I had a different special guest on last month to talk about Jesse Schell's Book of Lenses, which you might be grateful to have skipped because it is such a huge book.
Yeah. No, I like brevity.
Yeah. And since then, in our Discord server, one of our members, Tyler's, has actually implemented Lenses Bot, which is every day it posts one of Jesse Schell's, they're like cards of, here's a thing you should think about in relation to your game, which is a neat little tool. This month we're on to something a little bit lighter here on Game Developers Library, and so far we've sort of covered two types of books. We've done some sort of stuff that's kind of considered game design canon. So Ralph Costa, Jesse Schell is stuff you would be assigned in a game dev course usually as like, this will start you thinking about game design. And then the previous episode I did with you was on Spelunky.
Yep.
The boss fight books, Spelunky book.
My Bible.
It's great. Genuinely a really good introduction to everything you have to think about when you're making a game, both in terms of design and like general practice, and done through the story of one game. I really didn't expect it to tick so many boxes. And the book we're looking at today is a similar one. I put it in the category of developer stories. So it's kind of talking about, specific developers making specific games. But here we've got journalist Jason Schreier, and he's giving us an account of a bunch of different games being made in the book Blood, Sweat and Pixels. And we'll talk about each one a little bit and then talk about the kind of general structure of the book. But like in your mind, who is this book for? Like what kind of person do you imagine when you read this and think, oh, this is who this would be perfect for?
It's kind of interesting because it explains a lot, probably too much for someone that's like part of the industry. There's like, he'll often talk about, this company making a strategy game, and then he'll explain what a strategy game is. So I think it's probably people that are interested in games that aren't necessarily making them, or possibly interested in getting into the games industry and want to like learn more about, how the sausage is made.
Yeah. So it's a journalistic account, and it's written like long form essays that you might read in a magazine or something.
Yeah.
But I think this would be good as a primer for someone that's maybe like 17 or 18 and they're going to uni to study game dev, but they don't have much background knowledge. Because I think the way that this book is structured, the order of the chapters, it's not necessarily like chronological of when a game was released. The chapters are ordered to introduce you to particular concepts in a particular order, so that when you get to a chapter later on, it makes sense. Because there's like, so for example, Pillars of Eternity is the first chapter, and he uses Pillars of Eternity to talk about Kickstarter.
Yeah.
And then he uses Kickstarter to talk about how games are usually funded and how Kickstarter is different. And then that gives you a sense of how publishing works and stuff like that. So it's like, it's not an explicitly educational book that's trying to say this is how the games industry works, but the way that the chapters are ordered like gradually builds up a foundation of stuff you might not have known if you were just a gamer.
Yeah, and I guess it's also for people that might wonder like why some games, succeed and others fail, or why some never see the light of day in the first place. And, if you get excited about a game, that can be very disappointed if that gets delayed or doesn't get released at all. And I think this is a good insight into like a lot of the reasons as to why that happens.
Yeah, it kind of made me. I have a quick question for you, unrelated to the book, before we get into the first chapter. But can you remember what the first game was where you followed the development, like actively followed the development and like read about it on forums and stuff like that?
I think it was the original Fable, back when it was Project Ego originally. And yeah, I remember getting very excited about the, promise of it and, being this living, breathing world that, it didn't end up being, but it still ended up being this sort of classic and quite formative game for me. But yeah, that's the one that I remember. It's like, there's a game that isn't out yet that will be out one day, and, I'm getting bits of information that are making me more and more excited.
I had a similar experience. I had it with Fallout 3.
Yeah.
And I'd played the first two, and I was following the development of Fallout 3 along on No Mutants Allowed, which was like the Fallout community forums. And there were like debates about like what changes and what do you lose when you go from a top-down isometric game to a 3D first-person game, all of that kind of happening. And I remember that was really the first game. I'd thought about the design of games before, and I tinkered myself making games with like level editors, but that was like the first time I was really sort of conscious of what's going on in a studio and what sort of decisions are they making and stuff like that. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this book is it's trying to give the readership a sympathetic view of game developers, which I think in the last 10 years, when we've seen a shift from like traditional games journalism to sort of rage bait content creators, there is a very generally antagonistic stance from gamers towards game developers. And I feel like this book is pushing back against that. And I don't know how deliberate that is, or if it's just because Jason Schreier is a reasonably old school games journalist, but it's very much written from a point of sympathy for game developers and like trying to get you to realize, like again, imagining that 17-year-old that's just about to go to college, imagine trying to get that sort of person to realize, look, I know you think you could make better decisions about this and you could make this better and you think you know better than these people, but their job is really hard, And
it is a job that you go to, and there's bosses and investors and
so I feel like that's the general stance of the book, I think, and it might not be particularly revolutionary, but it is written in this way of like, games are made by humans. Did you know that? And this is how that happens. And that might seem very, very obvious. I mean, for the sort of people that listen to this podcast in general, it's going to be very, very obvious. But I do think that is something that is still... it's not an alien concept to people, but there has been a growing antagonism between gamers and people that make games that has been getting worse and worse over the last 10 years, I would say. And I feel like this occupies a nice space in relation to that.
Well, that's actually probably a pretty good lead into the book, because I think he starts with like an interview with someone where they're talking about how every game's a miracle, and
that's like the general thesis of the book, right? Is games are made by people, and it's remarkable that any games get made at all. I mean, we do get this introduction before we go into a specific chapter about a game, which is basically focused on that. It tries to make you think about why making a video game is so hard, to sort of prime you for the rest of the book. So you've got the fact that they're interactive, the technology keeps changing, scheduling is really hard, production management is really hard, and fun is hard to find. So in the intro you get this, is it Super Plumber Brothers or something? It's like, imagine you're making a game and it's called this, and he kind of just makes up Mario, and then which I think is a good example, because it's a bit annoying that often when we're teaching about game design we always have to start off with Mario or Tetris or something, but I think it does help to go back to really simple games, because you can still then give examples of how complicated it gets even with a really simple game, right?
Yeah, like, I mean, I guess the Atari era was like a little bit different, where you had those like rock star developers that would, do, copious amounts of drugs and then pump out, Centipede or something like that. Whereas, I think Mario is starting to get like a more modern structure where, you've got these sort of specific roles and, there's a bit of a hierarchy, and it resembles, like, it's got all the parts that like a modern game has.
And then And that gives us quite a strange shift when we go into the first chapter, because as I said, the first chapter is talking about Obsidian making Pillars of Eternity, and it's a strange one to start with. I think it's a strange chapter to start with because, again, it's being used to set up this idea of like, okay, here's what is something we would think of as a AAA game in terms of its like scope and budget, but they are traditionally made this way, which is like, you know, publishers investing in them. And what started happening around, when's the Kickstarter boom? Like 2010, 2012, around that kind of time. And sort of introducing this. And at no point is he going, this is how all games will be made in future, because the rest of the games on this list aren't necessarily funded that way. But it's sort of, it's foregrounding it both to sort of explain the diversity of ways that games get made, and to sort of like compare I guess the fact that it's always changing, and like even after the industry's been around for like 30 or 40 years, then a new way of making games kind of comes along.
Yeah, I guess he sort of starts that chapter sort of describing the shift, because you know, it starts with like where Obsidian was at that moment, and you know, they were basically a work for hire studio, and they were trying to make their own thing, but you know, there wasn't money for that. They were sort of, you know, living hand in foot a little bit.
Yeah.
And Kickstarter was their way to sort of break that cycle.
Yeah. And were they working on it at the same time as one of the South Park games? Was it roughly about?
I think so. Yeah, they had two teams at that time.
Yeah, so still very much like an RPG studio, but doing work for hire RPGs with other people's IP. So
yeah.
The Kickstarter was the thing that allowed them to kind of do what they were good at, but with their own IP. One thing that I think is missing from this chapter that then made me feel skeptical of the rest of the book, or the tone of the rest of the book, is like, I was around when Pillars of Eternity was being kickstarted. I remember following it on, like, I was on Twitter and following it and stuff like that. I was quite excited about it. I like isometric RPGs, so new big budget isometric RPG was something exciting to me.
I just wanted another Baldur's Gate 2.
Yeah, exactly. And then we ended up getting Baldur's Gate 2, but really weird.
Yeah.
That's the thing with Pillars of Eternity. Everything in it is deliberately weird just to make it weird. But still a good game. But the thing I remember happening at the time, and I looked it up, because there's no mention of this in the book, is the controversy over the backer-created content. Do you remember this happening at the time?
No, I don't.
So when you run a Kickstarter, and this is like why people have Kickstarter consultants and stuff now, one of the reasons why is, you know, you're offering people, but you're asking them to support the game, and then you're offering them some rewards, and some of it might just be you get the game when it comes out, and some of them are, you know, the generally bad idea is loads of physical things that you have to ship, because you don't know, you know, if someone is going to introduce a ridiculous trade tariff or something like that. So if you promise people t-shirts, you might end up promising a $10 t-shirt and spending $50 shipping it and stuff. So a lot of Kickstarter campaigns do like digital only things, and some of those will be like, you get to co-create the content in some way. You get to like design a character or something. And one of the things Pillars of Eternity did, it did these like gravestone things around the world, and they could be like backer written.
Yeah.
And they didn't really have anything in place for quality controlling those. And there was a big furore at the time about, you know, some of the stuff people had put into them was quite offensive. Some of people had put quite like bigoted stuff into them. And there wasn't like a safeguard in place to really stop that happening. So it was, at the time, in my mind, it was the first big Kickstarter I was aware of that had that kind of backer-created content as a part of their Kickstarter offer, and had really fluffed it. Yeah. And that's just not here in this book, because that chapter is so interested in selling Pillars of Eternity as a big success story in terms of this studio, like, you know, turning their fortunes around and being able to do their own thing because they rode the wave of this new funding paradigm.
Yeah.
That it doesn't touch that at all.
Yeah.
It doesn't even mention it in passing.
Well, it is interesting because they talk about their relationship with their backers.
Yeah.
And I think there is like a sentence where they say, yeah, it was, you know, sometimes there were bad experiences.
Yeah, exactly.
That's doing a lot of work there. Yeah.
That was the thing that went on for quite a few months, and it might just be like the subsection of the Twitter that I was in, but there were a lot of people that were very, very upset that they let this kind of like bigoted content get in the game because someone had given them $300 or something, whatever it was. So that was interesting, and I think from my experience of reading this book, that kind of set me up to be a bit skeptical of the rest of it, although I wasn't then going through the rest of it with a fine-tooth comb and going, that didn't happen. But it was just an unfortunate thing that happened because of the order of the book for me.
Yeah, no, that's a bit of a shame, but I guess it's not quite the story he was trying to tell.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing. It's a lot of this is take it with a pinch of salt. And again, really good primer if you're just starting to think about the games industry, or if you know someone. This is a really good present book for like a friend or family member that is interested in this stuff, and you want to give them a primer on loads of different concepts. But yeah, not necessarily. It's kind of printing the legend of these games.
Yeah.
Rather than.
Well, like I'm glad it exists because there isn't like an awful lot of insights as to like what the work actually looks like. Like the only other sort of thing I can think of is that TV show Mythic Quest. Yeah. Which is like so far removed what game design or development looks like.
I feel like Taika Waititi's character in Free Guy is quite close to some people I've worked for. But yeah, I mean that's the big caveat on a lot of this book. It does, in terms of insights, it does this thing of like it will get a few chapters in, and then now you need to know what a producer is. So we'll tell you what a producer is. It does that kind of thing. So. Edutainment kind of stuff. Did you have any thoughts on the Uncharted chapter, the Naughty Dog chapter?
It was kind of interesting because it seems to come across as pro-crunch, which if you're sort of using this book as like an introduction to what the game industry is, so you're going to talk about crunch eventually.
Yeah.
And to sort of have the very first story about that is like, yes, we crunch and we know we're going to crunch, and you know, crunch is the reason that our games are so good.
Yeah.
Is like it's a bold, and like I don't think Jason Schreier is, you know, unskeptical of it, but yeah, it's that seems to be the crunch chapter.
Yes, it's like, hey, Naughty Dog, they make these games, they're very beautiful. Characters can get in a bed properly in these games. Look at what they do with cloth. The example that they give, that they spend a lot of time talking about, is the grain bags in the shootout scene, which I kind of empathise, and it's sort of, again, it's painting a rosy picture of the studio, but I have a very romantic idea of like working somewhere like that where everyone really, really cares about that level of detail, because I would love to work somewhere like that, and I feel like a lot of my working experiences have sort of beaten that out of me.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it does touch on something that's true. Like, you get these passionate, creative people, and I think their internal phrase for it is feeding the beast. And, you know, you've got these creatives that sort of have an insatiable need to be able to, like, make something and make it perfect.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good instinct to have, but when that sort of, like, collides against, you know, the relationship of labor and, you know, the people who actually own the game, and it's it's uncomfortable, but it is an interesting insight into that studio and crunch in game development.
Yeah, like you could, a lot of crunch sort of stems from this intersection of like people doing what the game needs versus what they want the game to do on top of that. Like it's like you the easiest way to avoid crunch in a lot of places is just not to do any of this polished stuff, and it's kind of like it kind of raises interesting questions about, like, I guess if you go back to a really old studio like you know, ID, when they were making Doom or something, it's like everyone there is kind of their own boss, and any decisions they make about how much to work and stuff are sort of taken unilaterally, because it's like a band making music. It's a team of people, and
and you hear stories from that studio at that time, and like and a lot of studios at the time where it is kind of like a frat house where everyone's just hanging out with their friends and, you know, doing LANs and making games till 9 in the morning, and it's
and then that fundamentally clashes with like a larger place with HR and everything and stuff like that. The Uncharted chapter, we get introduced to the concept of crunch, I think, and it's it is introduced in a reasonably neutral way, which is surprising. And I think, again, we've got so much coming from the developer's voice in this because it's come from interviews. And one of the things that he sort of highlights in the introduction is when he's talking about how this book is written is sometimes you get interviews with people and you know who they are, and sometimes it's anonymized.
Yeah.
And that creates a strange dynamic because the more senior people at these studios are generally like in a better position to just say whatever they want, whereas people that are more junior or were more junior are always anonymized, and that creates a strange dynamic in this book, I think.
Yeah, I think Crunch hits different if you're like Neil Druckmann and like your name's on the game and like you get to have your name in lights versus, you know, a junior rigging artist or something. Like,
yeah, you're Tom Hanks in Saving Private Ryan rather than a random person dying in the background doing the Wilhelm scream.
Yeah.
So then we get we'll go on to the next chapter. We get a big jump here now in terms of like scope and everything, because the next chapter is about Stardew Valley, and I think there are a few games in this book that would be considered indie games, but the most obvious ones are Stardew Valley and Shovel Knight.
Yep.
And they're an interesting contrast in and of themselves, because Stardew Valley is a solo project and Shovel Knight had a very different kind of team structure. Anything that jumps out at you in the Stardew Valley chapter?
I think Stardew Valley's probably the one, or the game and the chapter that's most interesting to the Indie Game Clinic audience, because I think that's like a lot of people starting out making games and indie games think, you know, I can sit down at my computer and lock myself away for X amount of time, and at the end of it I'll have a product that I can release out into the world. And, you know, that's kind of the story of Stardew Valley, and, you know, it was hugely successful and beloved and, you know, financially successful. But I don't think that's the typical story of what happens when you do that. Yeah.
And I think the thing is, it can be a very educational story, but you have to look at the specifics of it, which is like someone loved a particular game that didn't exist anymore, or had been an IP that had gone astray to some degree. So they decided, I'm going to remake that game and do some quality of life fixes and add some features and stuff. But fundamentally, I'm going to clone a game to a very high standard of quality, and then I'm going to add stuff. And the majority of people who are trying to follow that thing as an indie developer, they don't really set the bar that high.
Yeah.
You know, and what Eric Barone did, you know, I played Harvest Moon when I was a kid. I had a lot of SNES emulators and stuff like that, and I played it really late, like 10 years after it came out on an emulator. And I remember playing the games after that on like the Game Boy GBA maybe, and just thinking, oh yeah, I don't like this as much, it's a bit bloated. I really liked how much the original Stardew Valley was like, it was very cozy, like in terms of there weren't many maps.
Yeah.
You know, there were like 4 or 5 maps of places you could go, and you go somewhere like 100 times and then there would be a secret of something you'd walked past a million times and you hadn't seen. So I always felt very warm about those. And then I think when this came out, it was like, oh yeah, he's done it. He's like made a thing that feels like it's of the quality that Nintendo would have released it at. So it's weird because it is a kind of example of survivorship bias when people go, well, that person made a game entirely on their own, and it's like, yeah, but they made a game entirely on their own to that standard, you know, and a lot of the design work was already done because they were copying something, which is another thing, you know. So I think if you apply that to other things where it's like, oh, people want to make Hollow Knight, it's like, okay, can you make something that is as visually beautiful as Hollow Knight?
Yeah.
Like, do you have the skills to do that?
Yeah, and if you are, I hope you're not releasing it this month.
Yeah, listeners from the future, Silk Song just came out, so no one make a Metroidvania or anything with bugs in for a while, because the Metroidvania and bug game market are currently, I mean bugs as in actual mini beasts, not glitches.
But I think the thing with Stardew Valley is, like, you're right, it sort of saw the wave coming rather than chasing the wave. Well, I guess it was like chasing a much earlier wave that, you know, people had forgotten about and had sort of fallen into licensing hell between Harvest Moon and The Story of Seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was sort of like a prime market for him to sort of sweep on, and we sort of had the cozy game craze since then, which I'm pro cozy game. I think it's good that we've got a lot of cozy games. I think it's gotten a lot of people into gaming that might not have gone into games otherwise.
Well, it was really just a thing that, like, if you went back, I don't know, if it depending on where you were exposed to games, if you're on a PC or something, if you wanted games that were non-violent and had like domestic settings about everyday life, a lot of those just didn't exist, or they were very shallow. And like the fact that The Sims has been the only Sims for a very long time is sort of evidence of that to some degree. I mean, in some ways, some of the audience for The Sims moved over to things that were like online things like Habbo Hotel or IMVU and stuff like that. But it's just, it's been kind of empty, and there's been a lot of stuff that didn't have much depth in. So the kind of current cozy games thing, it's weird because some of it are these like life simulator games like Stardew Valley, but some of it is just anything with a soft aesthetic where you don't fight anything gets kind of lumped into it, which is strange. But I mean, that's what hardcore games was as well, like in you can put Dark Souls in the same aesthetic category as like Twisted Metal or some like violent racing game that's kind of edgy and dark, so why not have that in other directions, I guess. I think this chapter sort of draws us back to funding again, because there's the whole thing of like he was only able to work on this game because he had a very supportive partner. And I remember raising that in a video once, and someone in the comments said, "Oh, does it? They jokingly said, "Oh, does it make you not indie if you have a girlfriend, if you have emotional support?" And I thought, well, yeah, that's funny, but also, this isn't emotional support. That is financial support. To have someone paying for the rent while you work on something is a form of being funded.
Yeah, it's essentially a patron.
And I think one of the things that sticks out in this story, because Schreier interviews Eric Barone and he interviews the partner. Sorry, I can't remember her name right now. But she really liked Stardew Valley as well. So there's a sense of there being a shared mission there. And okay, like she's not the publisher. She's not his producer or anything. But there's a degree of buy-in there of like not just, oh, you have a hobby and I don't mind you doing your hobby, but like actually I believe in what you're doing and I think you can do something good that is going to make money and make people happy and stuff like that. Which I think, I mean, it's still a very male-dominated hobby. You still get this kind of attitude of, it's like it with like music gear and stuff, of like these memes of like, oh, my wife's angry because I bought some guitar pedals and stuff like that. There's still a bit of that attitude in most technically oriented hobbies that have a lot of men in. And like the support of someone who actually has the same hobbies as you and is interested in them, to the point where they actually support what you're doing rather than tolerate it.
I think for years.
I think that is relatively rare, and I think it's good that is kind of focused on in this story, because it's something that a lot of people don't have, and I don't think it's a prerequisite. I don't think, if you want to take insane gambles with your career, I don't think your partner has to support that. But if you want your partner to support that, then it probably helps to start from a position of liking the same stuff,
Yeah. But I mean, you sort of think, how a similar story could have gone where, he didn't have that support network and he tried to do the same thing but had to, work a job for, 9 to 5 and then come home and try and do that. Like, the game never would have gotten made. Like, that's just such a... And, he was working very long hours on that game with the support. So I think it would have been completely infeasible if he didn't have that. And I don't think that's a very common thing.
Well, one of the things that jumped out at me in terms of how this chapter is written, and this is a very small bugbear I have with it, is that Schreier describes stuff that Barone was doing as if it's like exceptional or unusual, like, oh, and he had to redraw all the sprites again.
Yeah.
And they had to reprogram this, and I'm reading it thinking, well, that's what happens. Every part of a game. Like, I think if you're not redrawing all your art at some point, then you probably just haven't seen what's wrong with it.
Yeah.
And this is like a general bugbear I have with a lot of games journalism when it tries to talk about development, is they take something that's very normal or standard and talk about it as if it's exceptional or unusual. Like, I've seen videos talking about how Valve playtested Portal, and they're like presenting it as if like Valve has mastered playtesting. It's got this crazy playtesting method, and it's just like, no, that's just normal product testing from like any tech company. It's just, you're surprised. You have this association that games is play, so then you're surprised when people have a professional approach to game development, and it's just like, no, that's just how a functional studio would do that.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if it's sort of a comparison to like other creative fields, like, you know, making a movie or something, where, you know, there's a very linear process of like, you write a script and then you shoot it and then you edit it, and like, you know, you get reshoots and touching up things.
Yeah, but you don't you don't reshoot the whole movie, right? Which you do refactor most of your code. Like a game is like a ship of Theseus that gets replaced every 6 months. You know, a lot of it. So yeah. But yeah, that was a little quirk of the writing that I found myself kind of slightly frustrated with. We've got a chapter on Diablo.
Yep.
We've got a chapter on Halo Wars.
Yep.
Either of those, anything jumped out? I mean, the Diablo 3 chapter is about all the stuff that people would remember about Diablo 3, the auction house, people being annoyed about the auction house.
Error 34.
Yeah, Error 34. So here we get, I guess, an insight into live service games more than we've had in previous chapters.
Yeah, which again is like such a huge part of games, like especially modern games. And like, this book's fairly old now, so I think you know, live service is an even bigger part of the games industry than it was probably when the book got released.
I mean Destiny is a new game in this book.
Yeah. But yeah, like, I mean, he's got an entire book on Blizzard now, so I can save that for another podcast.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things from here, from a design perspective, is there's a lot of talk here about how trying to design the controls to work for the console then filtered back to the entire game.
Yeah.
Which is something we see over and over again. We don't necessarily see it happen in an individual game, but you get games that start off as PC games, and then as they try and capture a bigger audience, they become console-ified, right? So, I mean, The Witcher is another chapter later on, and the first Witcher game is the game that prompted Yahtzee to come up with the PC gaming master race meme.
Yeah.
Because The Witcher 1 was like this clunky single-player MMO game with all these menus. And then you play The Witcher 3 and it's like a very reasonably smooth, like, action RPG thing.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of talking about that in relation to Diablo, of like, oh, they were like, we can't have a dodge roll, you know? So yeah, that's kind of most of the stuff that's covered in Diablo 3.
Yeah, there was like a interesting sort of point they had about how sort of beholden they were to Diablo 2, and there was like a difference between like how good Diablo 2 really was and how good people remember it. And that's like one of the reasons that there was like, you know, contention over adding a dodge roll, because people thought, well, Diablo 2 didn't have a dodge roll, and that was perfect, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes the very good point that the Diablo 2 that people remember isn't the original release of Diablo. It's like this, you know, you've got the nostalgia element of like, you don't really remember the thing, right? And also just the fact that games are released in like iterative chunks. It's like, you know, like you could say this about any live service games, but people's understanding of, you know, Warcraft at various points is just... It's a totally different game.
Yeah, well, I mean, my Warcraft 3 experience is mostly through the custom maps that it had. So the actual like campaign is like such a small part of like the nostalgia of that for me. Yeah,
totally. We've got a chapter on Halo Wars, which I remember playing briefly on the Xbox, and this was, you know, I grew up playing RTS games occasionally on the PC, but then we always had a very old PC. And then I would occasionally try and play Command & Conquer on the PlayStation 1 or something. And I was a sicko, so I played Command & Conquer all the way through on the PlayStation 1.
Oh, you poor man.
But there was this, you know, broadly held and probably correct opinion that consoles are not the place to be controlling more than one character.
No. Well, you just think about the user input from a controller. It's just completely wrong for navigating a map like that.
Yeah, and it maps so well onto controlling a single character. You know, I play games on the PC with a controller all the time if it's a character controlling game. As soon as it's a thing about selecting things, and you know, there's a level of indirectness with an RTS, isn't there, where you're not really you're giving orders to units and then they do their own thing.
Yeah, you're painting in very broad strokes.
Yeah. So we get a bit of that, which is kind of allows us to talk about genre. Like you say, like you said at the start, it's like a strategy game is where you click and then you think. It's a bit like that. But the thing that's interesting about this chapter is Ensemble Studios were working on an RTS, or they'd been working on RTS games for ages, and they sort of had set themselves a challenge of making a console RTS. And then Microsoft were like, okay, but you know, we remake this with Halo now. And thought that would be an easy ask. And it's like, well, we have to change loads of things. And so there's a weirdness of being given an IP for a game that you're sort of already making.
Yeah.
And what that does in your process. And then there's the weirdness of Bungie not knowing that Microsoft had done that for a very long time. So... yeah, like Bungie sort of, you know, Microsoft have the license for Halo, but it's Bungie's baby, and then Microsoft have secretly told this other studio they can make a Halo game, and they haven't told Bungie, and then there's like this awkward moment where Bungie come to the Ensemble Studios studio, and they're all excited to show them the game, and it goes down really poorly because Microsoft haven't briefed them and told them, hey, we've told these guys to make a Halo game.
Yeah.
So, I think that's a good bit of storytelling, because he doesn't really beat you over the head with how much of a mess up this is.
Yeah.
But it clearly is. And it's like,
And that's, you know, there's like a lot of conflict when they originally said, hey, this original game that you're making, this is Halo now. So they just seem to be hopping between studios, upsetting people. It's
yeah, like he doesn't directly say Microsoft are really bad in this situation, but he gives you enough puzzle pieces to make you go, oh wow, there's a chain of events here and lots of miscommunication.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, I'm not a person that gets excited or nostalgic about Halo Wars, but I do like that chapter because it gives you a lot of strange examples of things going wrong in particular ways.
No, like, I mean, I do often like think about Halo Wars because they did get like strategy like as probably as well as anyone's ever managed to do it on a console. So like it is an accomplishment, you know, in that aspect.
I mean, it does keep getting better. Like, I've played Paradox games on the PS5. Like, I play Age of Wonders on the PS5 with a controller, and it's not terrible. But again, that's turn-based, which is like, you can slow everything down. You can kind of work out the perfect button mappings and stuff. Whereas the kind of point and clicking in real time that you need to do Warcraft 3 or something is just.
Yeah, it's such a square peg in a round hole. Yeah,
it's a mouse, and then it you know, mapped quite well onto touchscreens later on, which is why we got, you know, top-down touchscreen MOBAs like Vainglory and stuff like that. Halo Wars. Have you got any other notes on Halo Wars?
No, not really.
No, it's kind of a weird one. It's just like. Lots of weird things happening at once where you've got a publisher and then you've got a studio that works for the publisher and they sort of own the IP, but not to the point where the publisher can't ask someone else to make another game in that. It's so weird.
Like, it is sort of a interesting sort of story about, you know, the artistic side where they had a vision for this world and, you know, something original they wanted to make, and like the people that are actually paying the bills coming along and saying, well, this will sell better. There's some interesting stuff there about the sort of story in the game having some subtext about the studio, but I don't know how much of that is Schreier sort of like reading into it after the fact, because it's never like explicitly said that any of the kind of creative team decided on that. The chapter after that is about DragonAge Inquisition.
So here we get some nice looping back and forth about game studios because we get the BioWare legend here.
Yeah.
And then that's linked back to Pillars of Eternity and some of that being linked to BioWare. And then later on we get The Witcher 3 and they're like,
yeah,
these are guys that wanted to make a BioWare game. Inquisition. This is also framed in relation to EA a lot.
Yeah.
Did you pick that up?
Yeah. Yeah, he never explicitly says, these people are the villains of the piece, but it's there's definitely a couple of antagonists that you can pick
so
out.
You get EA wins an award for being the worst company ever in 2012 and 2013, I think. And then it's trying to claw back its reputation. So Inquisition here is positioned as being like one of the games that EA wanted to kind of win its hardcore gamer audience back with.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting when you see it in the light of like what's just happened with Veilguard and people being really upset with Veilguard basically being God of War. I didn't think Veilguard was that bad. I feel like BioWare's games have been gradually going more and more in that direction for like 10 years of becoming like story action games rather than RPGs. That's been happening since the first DragonAge. You know? Anything that jumps out here? There was some interesting stuff about, was it the Frostbite engine that they changed to?
Yeah.
So you get a EAY mandate to change tools. Like the whole every studio that works for EA needs to use EA's own engine now, and the skills you have on your team and the everything else be damned.
Yeah, that is like a big part of game development, is just learning to use new things, and it's not always because a mandate comes down from above, but there is always evolution of engines and tools and technology, and there is always a learning curve going between those things, and I find like a lot of the times when those things happen, you end up losing people from the industry that say, I'm not interested in doing this anymore, I'm going to go do something else, and then new faces arrive and that becomes the thing they learn. So I think one of the keys to longevity in the games industry is being able to take those changes and adapt. But in terms of like a production, it's hugely disruptive.
I sort of agree and understand. I've had that experience with game engines before. I've had that experience with music software as well. It's like, if you use the same tool for a very long time and you never use anything else, you sort of get this idea of yourself as just being a software user of that thing. And if you do jump around a little bit, you develop a bit more of like a broad global confidence of like, if I need to use something else, I can. And you start to see how things are similar to each other and different to each other and all that kind of stuff. So it's like you need to be prepared for that kind of stuff, because it's not always just going to be EA says you need to use a different engine. But the way that this messed with the project here is quite extreme. So you get some very weird stuff happening, like loads of level design done before they have any game mechanics. It's like it's just such a fundamentally backward thing, and I think maybe in the type of game this is, it doesn't hurt as much because combat is like an encounter that happens on a piece of ground. You might have you might have some elevation rules and stuff to do with if the archer's up there, but generally speaking, it's not like if you worked this way for a shooter or something, you would be screwed because you'd have to rebuild the levels after you've done it, or
like a big set piece game, like a Naughty Dog game. That would have been completely infeasible.
So I think that was the highlight of that chapter for me, was just the kind of all of the offshoots and like aftershocks of that stuff to do with the game engine, really.
And also EA actually responding to criticism and wanting to try and change public opinion.
I mean, them getting that award in the first place is sort of it's a little bit of what I was talking about earlier about the kind of antagonistic relationship between gamers and the games industry at large, of like, gamers are a group that would deliberately mass vote for that to be a thing in the first place.
Because I'm not going to defend EA, but you know, they're not like a weapons manufacturer.
Yeah,
or something.
I mean, people that are really into cars aren't going to en masse do that to Ford or something,
Yeah.
are they? It's like the level of investment, not just in the product or the product being good, but also in trying to control who makes it and how is so high in games that would happen, and I think that's interesting in and of itself. Shovel Knight.
Yes.
I've only ever played Shovel Knight for about an hour or so. Never got sort of super deep into it.
I've definitely finished it before. I can't remember which platform it was on. It might have been like the Wii.
But it always struck me as like it was the middle ground between sort of Mega Man and a Ghosts and Goblins or a Castlevania. Of like it had sort of Mega Man size sprites and everything, but it was sort of medieval and very melee driven. And
and it had like some things that were clearly inspired by Dark Souls, like being able to recover resources from the last place you died.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing in and of itself, because you get these games, and I think UFO50 is a more recent example of this, where you have an aesthetic and an art style and even a color palette and stuff like that is doing retro games, but there are game design decisions that wouldn't have existed in the original thing, like the Dark Souls thing of like, oh, you need to go back and get this thing and stuff like that. And I think people don't get that sometimes when they're working on games. They see the kind of retro aesthetics and they think, oh, you're just remaking that thing, and it's like, no, it's an art style.
Yeah.
it's an art style. It maps somewhat onto like how complex the controls are. You know, you're not going to make a game that looks like Shovel Knight and then you control it with a mouse and a keyboard and do loads of like RTS. I mean, you might do, but that's there's like an association between like a simple art style and simple controls, but that doesn't mean that you can't do new mechanical stuff with the gameplay, right?
Yeah.
So Shovel Knight was a team of 5, I think, and they'd come from a existing game studio.
Yeah, do you remember which studio it was?
I can't remember, but this was like this. Again, it's interesting that this and Stardew Valley are in the same book, because they're both kind of small indie things, but they are very different. Like with Eric Barone with Stardew Valley, it is bedroom programmer who is just making something and never worked in a studio making something, and this is more like these people have made games before and then they're like, we want to make our own thing our own way.
Yeah, because they were like doing like remakes of retro games or something, and it was sort of again like a work for hire type studio.
But I find that inherently interesting, where you get people that are already making games in the industry and then what they make is like using those skills, which seems obvious, but I mean, you don't jump from a studio that is making RTS games and then go off on your own and make a FPS game or something. Or if you do, it's probably not going to be as good as if you do stay in your area. And it's like, I find that interesting. There's a lot of focus here on character designing the entire game around having a sort of lovable character that could be franchised and visually memorable, and all of the game mechanics are obvious from the title. You're going to be digging because you've got a shovel, that kind of stuff, which I think is a good lesson, I think, generally.
Well, they speak very explicitly about how they're modeling themselves on Nintendo and what they thought like a good Nintendo mascot would be, and like what Nintendo's design philosophies are. And I think if that's the sort of game you want to do, that's quite a useful like mindset to go into that having. I mean, this is just a general good practice for making a character platformer or any sort of character-driven game that is kind of cartoony, of like the character has a very clearly recognizable sort of attitude and thing that they do, and that's it. It's like the same with Sonic the Hedgehog. You've got Sonic the Hedgehog. He's not running around in a realistic city. He is in a world that is completely designed around Sonic the Hedgehog, and it's that kind of ethos as well. There is some interesting stuff about how they made decisions as a team. So you've got a team of 5, and basically they don't put anything in the game unless they all agree on it. Yeah.
And that only works because they have this initial alignment about what they're making anyway, which kind of comes back to the Stardew Valley thing of like, if you're making something that is such a clear homage to something, it's easy to get alignment on it rather than, if you have a kind of madcap thing where you're like, I'm going to do something no one has ever done before, that's maybe easier to do on your own, but like you're going to know what you're making a lot quicker if you're like, oh, we're making Mega Man, but you're a knight who digs or something.
Yeah, like it's part of, working on a creative team. Like, if you're working with, it sounds like a very close group of people like that, you might have like a little bit of a hive mind, but, in a creative project, you want to sort of set out those like pillars of the game like early on, and then that's sort of like your load star for the rest of development, where you can go, does this match our pillars? Then if it doesn't, then it doesn't need to be part of the game. We can safely chop it out. But yeah, having a shared vision with a group of people is like a much harder feat than, just having it all in your head and going at it.
Yeah, but it still relies on the same thing of just like having a clear idea of what you're making in the first place, and then just omitting stuff that doesn't adhere to that.
Yeah, it's interesting because like it sounded like it was a bit of a grueling development period for them, and I wonder how much of that sort of requiring complete agreement amongst everyone sort of hurt that process. Whereas if you had a dictator, like would that have been faster? But would it have created a product that's like as good?
Yeah, that's interesting, and we'll never know.
Yeah,
we can't like go back in time and test that, but it is interesting. Are you saying that they should have hired Peter Molyneux or someone?
Yeah, or Neil Druckmann by the sounds of the Naughty Dog chapter.
He would have made Shovel Knight have lots of stubble.
Yeah,
and a difficult past. One of the things I like about this chapter is because it's so much about that team. It's less about the game and more about the team. And I think one of the nice things to take away from it is if you're going to do that, if you're going to set a studio up and you're going to work with other people, then the whole point of doing that is that you have complete control not over just what you're making, but the conditions under which you make it.
Yeah.
And you don't have to just go, oh, my old studio had 45-minute stand-up meetings every morning at 9:15, so we're going to do that.
Yeah.
You're not just designing the game, you're designing the studio, which is the machine that makes the game, and you can decide how you make decisions or anything like that. Which I think is an interesting lesson in terms of like stuff to take away from the book, because people either start their indie game studio and they import the stuff they've learned elsewhere uncritically, or I get a lot of questions like this from people before where they're like, what's the proper way to do this?
Yeah.
And it's like, I've worked at lots of places that do the quote unquote proper way of doing that, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. So
yeah, well, I think designing the studio is kind of similar to designing a game, where I think the best way to design a game isn't necessarily to go, I like this game, I'm going to make it. I think it's better to go, I like this game, but I don't like these parts of it. Yes. I'm going to try and, do it that way. And I think it's the same with a studio where, I think it's quite valuable, working for another studio before, breaking out on your own, because you can, see how someone else has tried to do it, and you can go, well, this worked, but, this didn't, so, I'll try and do something else.
Yeah, I mean, parenting's a bit like that as well. You look at how you parented and you go, well, no one really knows the best way to do any of this, but I know that was probably bad and that was good, so I'll replicate that and not that. Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Agile has retros built into it, right? Yeah. Where you stop and you take stock of how you've been working and you think, okay, does this way of working work? But then you also need to have like retros on the retros.
Yeah.
So are we having retrospectives too often?
Yeah.
Do we really need to have one every week? That kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, that's a situation where those people have worked together before. So some of the stuff you don't have to have as many explicit conversations around it because you have a way of working and that's just how you work.
Yeah, I imagine it's something that might not necessarily scale. Like once you start, if you want to do something bigger in your next game, and it means you need to bring in people from the outside, then, you know, you need a way to onboard them or find a new way to work where,
Yeah,
you know...
you can't just work together as if you've always worked together immediately with people that you've only just met.
Yeah.
Which is where that storming, norming, performing thing comes from, right? Have you ever heard of that?
No.
There's like, it's in sort of, you get taught it in business studies. It's like a group formation theory where you've got these stages that groups go through where storming is just like everyone's sort of testing the boundary of what the group is and what it does, and then norming is like setting up the standards and habits and rituals of the group, and then you only get to performing after you've gone through those stages, right? Which is why, you know, at your workplace, if you go onto a totally new project but you're working with 75% of the people you're working with before, you just like smoothly flow into working on that thing because you have your norms established of how you work and stuff like that. It's kind of the same thing here. It's like it's a new studio, but it's not really new because it has all of these ways of working already established. The last 3 chapters, we've got Destiny, we've got The Witcher 3, and we've got a Star Wars game that never came out that was apparently very hyped at the time. Were you hyped for this at the time? I don't remember anything about it, but
no,
I'm a Star Wars head.
I looked up a bunch of the trailers and things after reading the book, and yeah, it looked pretty cool. But at the time, I wasn't on the train.
So Bungie, Destiny is an interesting one, because when Bungie started working on Destiny, they were effectively an indie studio.
Yeah.
They'd left Microsoft. And okay, by the time Destiny comes out, they've been acquired by Activision. But even then, Activision is kind of just letting them make what they want. And they're like, okay, you can have some more money if you get a good Metacritic, which is kind of what most of the big publishers do.
Yeah.
But generally, they let them get on with it. So then maybe there's a weird case here for Destiny being an indie game, like a AAA indie game.
Well, it starts with them signing like that Declaration of Independence document. So if you've got a document of independence, you've got much more indie than that.
So I'm imagining some sort of Hamilton stuff going on in the studio with tricorn hats and stuff.
Yeah. Like, I mean, indie's kind of a loaded term, because I think when people think indie, they think small, but...
Yes. Yeah, which is not the kind of economic meaning of it. Interesting sort of... I guess thinking about what we were just talking about like a studio being a set of people that is sort of set up in a particular way that ends up making a particular thing. Yet there's kind of a story here with Destiny where it was like they're trying not to make anything like Halo for a very long time, and then they just end up making another epic space game. And there's like, it's very funny that the game is called that. And it's like, no, sometimes the studio just has to make the thing that it has to make, and what you have to make is space operas. That's your thing. So there's a bit of that in there that I thought was very funny. We get a lot of focus on the struggle that Destiny had with narrative design and story, and just like
Moon Wizards
and Peter Dinklage and all of this kind of stuff. So I think that chapter is mainly just like a funny piece of nostalgia for people that were around at the time, probably more than anything.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think what the lessons that could be learned from that are. Is I guess, you know, I think he talks about it in the book about the sort of order that, you know, narrative often comes into video games. Was that in the Inquisition chapter, or was that the Destiny chapter?
I can't remember, to be honest, off the top of my head. It's not in my notes.
But yeah, I think the lesson is, if you want to make a epic, you know, space opera, you kind of need to know what the story is first.
Yeah, you can't paint that in too broad strokes. You need to have it up front. Which I think contrasts quite nicely with the Witcher chapter, because CD Projekt Red, I didn't really play The Witcher 2 or 1.
I think I installed The Witcher 2 once, and it ran so badly on my laptop that I couldn't keep going.
You get the impression with The Witcher 3 that it's like the creative leads of this are storytellers, and they care about that, and that's like the main thing this game is here to do, you know?
Yeah, well, it's almost the inverse of the Bungie story, where, you know, Bungie made Halo and then, you know, desperately wanted to get away from it, whereas it felt like, CD Projekt Red, like, The Witcher 3 was like that's what they were building up to over a long time.
And even if you compare it to like Cyberpunk 2077, which is after this book, you get a sense of like, this is a studio that knows what it does, and okay, there might be some big differences between those games, but you can look at them and you can see a shared set of like concerns. Both of them have this reverence for their subject matter, where you've got like a pulp context of like dark fantasy or cyberpunk that could be really puerile and just grim, but they always add like this layer of human warmth to all their characters and stuff that is just, it doesn't really need to be there. They can get away with not having it. We've had lots of games that don't do it, and they are just so good at it. There's a lot of that, and I think that the most interesting thing about this chapter, I mean, it's framed this way because it's kind of the only quote-unquote international game studio in the book, really. But you get all the backstory of CD Projekt Red before they were developers, right? Yeah. Which is like really interesting, and it's so what happened was, before they made The Witcher, they were sort of pseudo-professional, like localization. They were importing games and selling them in the local market when you couldn't get hold of particular types of games in Poland, and they were also localizing some of them or something like that.
Yeah, and they were coming up with like value adds to the project, so people would actually buy the physical copy rather than just downloading it.
Yeah. So they were trying to normalize purchasing video games instead of pirating them, and I think that's really interesting, because it made me think about like, what do we mean by games industry? And there's this like sort of permeability between game development and all of these other publishing related things that go on, and how like that's a really interesting story of like people taking opportunities in a local market to become a big fish in a small pond, and then eventually become a global kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's also, they sort of went into it with like a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, going, well, there's these companies like BioWare that are making these massive games. We want to do that, and just sort of through grit and determination doing that and surpassing them.
Yeah. It's a funny one. It's an ironic one if you like look at it in relation to Cyberpunk coming out afterwards, because there's a bunch of stuff in here about how they wanted this to be a 100-hour game, and they made a 200-hour game, and then it's like they either didn't learn anything and reapply it to Cyberpunk, or they just didn't care. They were just like, well, we just like making games that have so much stuff in.
Yeah. Or I wonder if there's like a little bit of like spectacle creep, where it's like, oh, well, we made a 200-hour game, so we can't scale down at this point.
And if that's what they want to do, then fine, but it can't be good for people. And I always just think those massive open world AAA games, just make them episodically. Like, release a quarter of the game, and let me buy a quarter of the game for 15 quid every year or so. It's what they do with MMOs. Just follow the MMO structure and make single player AAA games like that. But
just make a district in the city.
Yeah.
But the Witcher 3 chapter was like very interesting to me, like as an Australian, because like we've sort of got a similar population size to Poland, and like we're not a post-Soviet country, but like we haven't really been able to sort of get like a big AAA studio to sort of like grow out of a smaller studio.
That's interesting, yeah.
And I think there's some barriers in Australia, like we've got a much higher cost of living than Poland does, which I think makes it harder to sort of go from that middle studio to a large studio. But I think it's a problem that we kind of need to solve to be able to like sustain an industry.
Yeah. Also notoriously strict at censoring things over there as well, right?
Which is
why you'd never get a GTA that was made in Australia.
Well, it's a bit better now, because like all those controversies came out before we had a R18 plus rating.
So it's just a lot stricter. So things like it was things like drug references, and even if it's like a fictional drug in Fallout or something, Australia would come down really hard on it.
Yeah. I can't remember what the drug was, but there had to be like a special Australian version of the syringe in Fallout 3. But
it can be an inhaler.
Yeah.
It can't be a syringe, something like that.
But like Jason Schreier's follow-up book to this, Press Restart, is sort of about the broader implications of like how the industry works, you know, when a studio shuts its doors and like a bunch of small ones quite often end up springing out like dandelions in its wake. So having large studios is quite important to like the ecosystem of an industry. So yeah, that's why I hope Australia starts getting some bigger studios, because, you know, when they fail, then you get
good stuff.
You get good stuff, but
you get all of this pent up energy of like the thing someone has wanted to make for 10 years, and it's not a bedroom coder; it's someone who's actually made stuff and can do stuff.
Which is like interesting, because with Silksong coming out, that's an Australian studio, and I read an interview with them in, I think it was like GQ last week, where they were talking about how basically the last 7 years their lives haven't really changed all that much. Like, you know, they've got like a dragon's hoard of wealth, but, you know, they've been sitting in their apartments making this game. It doesn't sound like they've expanded this studio an awful lot. So yeah, I hope they have lots of success with this, but, you know, that's not translating to more games in Australia.
And
I mean, it's not their job to do it.
Some smaller companies do that. They go sort of set up like an incubator or something with like 15% of their income.
I mean, there's studios in Australia that do that, like Witchbeam that made Unpacking. Like, I've heard they've started like using, you know, the proceeds of that to fund other projects from other developers.
I think it's a very wise thing to do, because it's basically a way of getting over the sort of difficult second album problem. Of like, you might make a brilliant game as your first game and then never really be able to hit that again. And I think there are certain types of games where this is a particular danger. And it's like, you get certain studios where they can make a type of game and do it. Like Zachtronics, they can make a type of game over and over again. And when they've sort of veered away from that and tried to do something else that hasn't gone as well. And if you are the type of person that doesn't want to do that, and you make it like a breakout success, and then you're like, I don't really want to make one of those but then you're not good at doing the other thing you want to try and do. That's a bad position to be in. And I always kind of, I feel like I'd be a bit like that if I ever had a really good game, because I always want to learn to do something new and do something completely different from the last thing I was doing. And that's not necessarily conducive to sustainably making things that people like. You know, it's why artists like Prince or David Bowie have like a weird back catalogue where even people that really love them, they like hate half of their stuff because they were people that didn't want to always make the same thing. So I think if you've had a breakout success, you've got loads of money, and you don't want to like have to just churn out sequels of that thing again, then I think investing in other things is a good idea. And it basically puts you in a position where you can just be a tastemaker, and you can just go, okay, this is good. And I guess it just comes down to like, what do you provide on top of that funding? Are you like, what kind of like intervention are you having with those smaller studios?
But yeah, no, I thought that chapter was really interesting, and yeah, I think it's got a lot that studios can learn from now, and you know, sort of, I think a lot of indies, and especially successful indies, can afford to be like more ambitious and like try to scale up.
Well, there's I think one point that I think is helpful in that chapter as well is the way that the quality of the game emerges from having these very strict rules about particular things. So one of them is the quest design and no fetch quests. They called them FedEx quests. But basically every quest has to have some memorable thing in it, whether it's a twist, whether, you know, some sort of thing going on with character work, and they're not allowed to put anything in the game that breaks that rule. And that's a really good example of like, okay, that's very specific to like a narrative driven game with quests in, but the idea that the final quality of a game emerges from these rules and constraints that you put in. And it's like project pillars, like you talked about earlier, having a North Star for the project. This is what we're doing. But almost like sometimes those things are easier to follow when they're described in the negative. Of like, we will not do this. You know, we will do this and we will never do this. Sometimes that's kind of easier for people to actually adhere to and carry out if it's framed as like what you're not going to do.
And like you said, it doesn't have to be, you know, a narrative thing. It could be like, we don't have any boring UI in this game, and that's like a core thing. And then anytime you're doing a round of feedback or a review on something, you can like look at it and go, that's boring, that shouldn't be in the game, do it again.
Yeah, I think constraints are really kind of helpful, often more helpful than any other kind of design tool. So like John Romero's level design things for Doom example, like we don't make a window that you can see out of unless you can go out there, that kind of thing. And it's like, okay, that's a really good guiding principle, because it's just so clear. The Star Wars chapter, the LucasArts, this is like the last game we're going to talk about. This is a game that never got finished. It was apparently very hyped at the time.
Yep.
And it was like a third-person action game.
Yeah.
And it went through all of these changes and eventually started leaning towards being a game where you played as Boba Fett. Yeah,
that was I can't remember who that came down from, but that sounded like it came in quite late in development.
Yeah, and this chapter is a particularly interesting sort of slice of games history, because this is like the last Star Wars game made under LucasArts before EA takes on Star Wars and starts doing Battlefront and stuff like that with it.
Yeah.
And I think, like, so the struggle that they have here is Lucas keeps intervening but doesn't really understand video games.
Yeah.
So, like, it's like you said about movies earlier, you generally don't get the whole movie reshot. But some of the things they wanted to change about this mid-production, like the main character and what the main character can do, like just change everything.
Yeah.
Okay, we're changing the main character to a guy whose signature thing is their little jetpack.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, but we haven't designed any of the traversal mechanics around having a jetpack.
Yeah, imagine building a whole game where you need to like climb ladders and things, and then all of a sudden you've got a jetpack.
Yeah. So it's a nightmare. I think it's also a very specific type of story, because I think if you take LucasArts, the entire existence of LucasArts, which goes back to like the late 80s, I think, when it's established as a game studio, Lucas was very on board with making games of films to a high quality very early on. And you think, this isn't long after the terrible E.T. game in the 80s, and there wasn't a lot of interest in making movie tie-ins after that, and the ones that got made of like Indiana Jones and Blade Runner and stuff like that, they were very, very good. They were very polished. There were a lot of love was put into them, but I think the difference that the change that happens between those sort of point-and-click adventure games and this Star Wars 1313 doesn't really go into it so much in here, but I think reading into it, what's happened is the point-and-click adventure games were very aligned with what a movie is. So movie people could look at it and do their sign-off stuff and go, oh yeah, I get it. Indy goes here, he solves some puzzles, then Indy goes here. And it's like, it's all about the character, it's all about stuff that could happen in the film.
Yeah.
And they just naturally understand it, and they can greenlight things very easily and all of that. And then as soon as it becomes like a big complex action game, there's like this disconnect where you've got these sort of boomer studio lead people in the movie department that is above the games department, who have never played a video game and definitely never played a video game like this, where you have to like control a character with one joystick and a camera with another joystick, and like the level of disconnect that change causes between LucasArts being predominantly a point-and-click adventure studio that makes interactive narrative games to being an action game studio. It seems to be the problem here, you know. It's an interesting story about struggling to work in an IP where the people that have all the sign-off rights don't really understand games.
Yeah.
Which is it's one that I've found myself in before. It's very interesting trying to negotiate those sorts of things of like, but you do understand it's a video game.
It's sort of the weirdest intersection of like art and business, where, you know, you've got these characters, but they're like business assets, and you know, you need sign off from stakeholders before, you know, Boba Fett can, you know, do whatever he does in the game. And and I thought it was like an interesting story of like, because, you know, LucasArts was a legendary studio, but at that point it was like in decline and kind of needed a hit, and had a big swing, and sort of forces kind of out of their control, didn't make it.
Yeah, and I think it kind of it's very illustrative that the most memorable and beloved Star Wars game of the 2000s is the BioWare one, right? And that's kind of still a thing, really. So yeah, that's all of the games that this book covers. I think it does a good job of like covering a weird range of games, and I kind of like that it ends on that one, because as you say, a lot of these are weird success stories that, particularly the indie ones, where it's just like, yeah, that's not most people's experience.
Yeah.
I do like that we get Stardew Valley and Shovel Knight contrasted, because Shovel Knight is closer to the experience of most successful indie studios, which is like they have had an apprenticeship working for something else before they go indie. Like going indie isn't just like being 18 and deciding to make a game in your bedroom.
Yeah,
I think it was being a game developer who has worked for someone else and then deciding to start your own thing.
I think if I remember right, Eric Brown did like a programming and just an IT degree. It wasn't necessarily like a games degree either. So yeah, there's like a huge gap in knowledge between like doing a games degree and working in the industry, and a even bigger one between doing a generic IT degree and making a game. And even like if you take all of the kind of indie darlings from the original Boom, they all had something that was their focus. Like Ed McMullen is a comics guy, and that feeds into his games, and it's part of what people love about them. They love these kind of gross characters and what he has to say about religion and all of that. And like Lucas Pope is a UI guy before he makes Papers, Please, and then Papers, Please is the perfect confluence of like, this guy knows how to program user interfaces, and also he has this kind of thing he wants to say about oppressive governments, and it's like that is like the quintessential indie story. Is not someone didn't know how to make anything and then they learnt a game engine and then they made a game. It's like they already have some skills and some stuff they want to say and do with them before they make a game, even, which I think is something a lot of people miss. So I've got some summary questions, but I feel like we've touched on these a lot. So we've already talked quite a bit about, is this book helpful for developers? I think it is. Like, don't take everything as gospel, and don't think this is like the extent of experiences you can have in the games industry. But I think, it provides a lot of interesting insights and, looks at different personalities that you meet in the games industry.
Yeah, I think it does a good job of sort of showing you how broad the range of experiences are of like, what does it mean to make a game, and how does that work? Like, how does it work on the ground in terms of what you're actually doing? Where does the money come from? It's a very broad array of things,
and there's not a lot of books like it.
No, so I think it's still. It's if you already work in the games industry, if you already develop games, I find it quite entertaining to read.
Yeah.
I audibled it actually, so I had some certain kind of intonation from the voice actor that might have made things hit differently and everything. It's a good intro for someone on how games generally get made. Again, like you say, it's not gospel, but it introduces concepts in a way that you don't realize you're sort of learning them. It's like, a publisher is this is what a producer does, this is what a creative director does, all of that kind of stuff. I kind of like the emphasis on the human element and human stories and putting you on the side of the game developers.
Yeah.
It really is a book that is focused on that, and the idea that a game emerges from the people that make it and what they're good at and what they care about and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's important to sort of mention that the people that make games, focus on very technical skills that most of the time could earn much more money in different industries. Like, they're doing it for the love of the game, literally.
Yeah. I think that's quite interesting, and I think of like the kind of game dev culture on YouTube and places like that at the moment. You've got quite a lot of people where it's like they have some technical background and they want to make something and they're very unsure about what they want to make, and that's kind of, it's so alien to me. Like I've always had very strong feelings about the sort of things I want to make and not the technical skills to back them up. And I always think, if you don't even know what you make, or you're just sort of like chasing things around and going, oh, what should I make? What's popular now? And it's just never really how good things get made. You know, like people have some technical hands-on skill at making something, and they also have a strong opinion about what should exist, and then they try and make that thing. You know? So I kind of like that thing. I think the balance of voices in the book is quite weak. So Schreier admits to this very early on that it's a very male-dominated book because that's who he could get to be interviewed. And I think if you think of like job precarity and who is willing to be interviewed and all of that kind of stuff, then there's that element to it. But I also think it's very biased towards... it's not a bias, it's just it's a thing that, you know, it makes the book feel a certain way that, you know, we hear from the heads of studios a lot more than we hear from other named people on the team. And it, even though it's not intending to, it does kind of give you this auteur theory version of games where it's like, this person shaped everything because they're the person who has a name in the story. You know?
And like, I mean, I get it. Like, if you're trying to tell these broad stories of, you know, studios, you kind of need to talk to the people that made the decisions that led that. Like, you know, go back to my theoretical junior rigging artist, like, you know, they can tell you whether they're having a good time or a bad time, but, you know, that's, like, I mean, that's kind of what his follow-up book, I think it's called Press Restart, is about, where it is, you know, the little guy and what happens to them when, you know, studios implode. But yeah, it is the sort of history on horseback. I mean, version,
maybe that's deliberate. I don't know much about that book, but maybe that was one of the reasons why he wrote that immediately after this, was that. So yeah, I think this would be a very good first year text for sort of intro to game dev courses, because it doesn't feel like it's teaching you, but if you didn't know some of this stuff, it would just fill in the gaps in a very natural way of, like, you know, you're not going to then get caught out in a conversation when you don't know what a particular job role means or what QA is or whatever.
I guess also has the other upside of possibly scaring people off the industry if any of this is particularly unappealing to you.
And I don't think that's a totally bad thing. No. I think it should be a hobby. There's a lot of people who enjoy doing a thing as a hobby, and they don't need to do it as a job. That's just a general thing. And also just sort of, I guess one of the things that happens for lots of us is we have a thing that we enjoy doing, and we also want to be self-employed. So we assume that we need to put those two things together in a particular way. You know, and it's not necessarily what you have to do.
Like, I mean, I'm one of those sickos that, you know, I'll do game dev during the day and then I'll come home and it's like, oh, I need to work on my own stuff. But like, I know plenty of people that say, you know, I do my 8-hour day and that's like as much game dev as I can do, and I need to, you know, do other hobbies and, you know, develop other skills in that time. So, you know, different strokes for different folks.
Yeah, totally. And the part of that is just knowing yourself, isn't it? You had an idea for the next book we're potentially going to cover. I've got it down here. Up, Down, Up.
Yeah, that's it's a book that I've only just started listening to the audio book version of, but it's very much more about the business side, and, you know, it's interviews with successful studios and what the owners of those studios think are important to their success.
I have the subtitle here. Yeah, Up, Down, Up, Why Some Games Companies Succeed While Others Fail or Do Not, by Kim Nordstrom. It's interviews with over 100 of founders, CEOs and leaders in the industry. And we weren't planning on covering this, but then you said you were already reading it, and I thought, well, that sounds like a good pick, because what I've done is we've got lots of titles that people have suggested from our Discord community for this podcast, and I'm trying to make sure we start off with what people would expect to be on a podcast with the Game Developers Library. But then we have 5 tracks for different types of literature. So we've got game design sort of canonical texts, and we've done a few of those already, and we've also got developer stories, and we've done a few of those already. So game design canon, stuff like Jesse Shell, stuff that is explicitly about game design, And then developer stories are things that are more like, here is a journalistic account of some games being made, or a developer talking about their own game process. And then the three other sort of fields or tracks are, one is like stuff from other creative fields that we can learn from and apply in games. So after we've covered Kim Nordstrom, I really want us to do Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, because it's a comic about making comics. And there's a lot that anyone can learn there about designing cartoon characters, which is like relevant for most video games.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot in there about kind of information and how you convey information visually and things like levels of abstraction and stuff. So it is a book about comics, but it's also about sort of creative direction and visual communication and how you can kind of convey things through image. So I think that would be an interesting one to do as kind of starting that track of like stuff we can learn from other places, because a lot of game design theory comes from other places. It comes from like performance studies, or it comes from architecture, or it comes from psychology and stuff like that. And then the other two tracks were Games as Business, which we'll be kind of covering with Kim Nordstrom's book. And the last one I called Games and Society, which sounds like a sort of university module. But this would be anything that kind of comes from humanities or psychology and is about sort of players and what games do. So an example of that would be, I don't know, have you ever read Reality is Broken by Jane McGonigal?
No.
It's sort of a book about gamification and stuff like that. And it's a bit overly positive about how putting games in everything is going to make everything fantastic. I think that would be a good book to touch on at some point, because it calls a lot of shots. It's like 15 years ago calling all these shots about how games are going to change society. So I think it'd be funny to read now. But I think it was actually the first book I read that sort of took games seriously in a particular way. And although it was like overly celebratory about them, I think it's an interesting one to touch on. So we'll basically be cycling through these 5 tracks. And hopefully that should kind of give something for everyone. Because what I really want to do with this podcast is make sure we cover the stuff that people expect us to cover, but then also encourage people to branch out and be interdisciplinary, because you can't afford not to be as someone that makes games.
Well, yeah, I think we want to sort of surprise people rather than just give them a list of things that they're probably already going to read anyway.
Yeah, that's why we just did a game jam where people made music videos.
Yeah, get weird with it.
Get weird with it. Yeah, exactly. So, anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, it's a good book. Read it.
Yeah, read it or listen to it. I enjoyed listening to a book after doing a very heavy textbook last month. That felt like a treat. Jesse Schell doesn't have an audio book of The Art of Game Design, so if you're listening to this, Jesse Schell or Jesse Schell's agents, and you want me to read audio books of stuff, then I am available.
Yeah, and you've just got 90 minutes of what your voice sounds like.
Yep.
So yeah.
I mean, don't train an AI on it, and then just I put a disclaimer in here. I do not authorize my voice to be used as an AI for audiobooks. Thank you all very much. See you next time in roughly a month.